I was abandoned on the day I needed my family most, but I turned my pain into strength. And today I tell the truth they never imagined I would reveal. You know, people often look at an old man sitting quietly in his chair and think he's had a peaceful life. They see the wrinkles on my face and assume they're just from time, not from battles, betrayals, and nights spent wondering if tomorrow would ever come. But I'll tell you this, every line on my face has a story, and not all of them are kind. I was abandoned on the worst day of my life, left with nothing but silence, where love should have been, and with memories I never asked to carry. Some days I still hear the echoes of those moments, the slam of a door, the chill of an empty room, the gnawing hunger that became my closest companion. People say time heals everything, but I learned that some wounds don't close. They simply become part of who you are. I grew up in Leeds, England, back when life was supposed to be simpler. But for me, childhood was no place of safety. Poverty was not just a word, it was the air I breathed, the clothes I wore, the reason I often went to bed with an empty stomach. While other boys played football on the streets, I carried burdens too heavy for my small shoulders. Responsibility found me early, long before I even knew what childhood was meant to feel like. There were moments when I felt invisible, even in my own family. Love was something I learned to crave, not something I received freely. I remember cold nights when the wind rattled the windows, and all I had was the sound of my own breath to remind me I was still alive. Those were the nights I promised myself that no matter how life tried to break me, I would endure. And I did. But endurance came with a price. What hurts most is not just the hunger, the cold, or the loneliness. It's the betrayal. The realization that the very people who should have stood by me chose to walk away. On the very date when I needed them most, they left me behind. I'll never forget that day. Even now, as I sit here decades later, the memory is sharp as broken glass. But don't think this is a tale of defeat. No, it's not. I may have been crushed, but I was never destroyed. I may have been abandoned, but I was never truly alone. Though it took me years to understand that. There were strangers who became family, moments of unexpected kindness that lit my darkest nights, and a stubborn will inside me that refused to let go. Still, if you're listening to me now, you must understand this story is not easy to tell. There are chapters in my life that carry more pain than words can hold, and yet there are lessons carved deep into my soul by hardship, loss, and survival. So, let me take you back to the streets of Leeds in the years when I was just a boy. Back to the times when hope was a fragile thing, and love seemed like a luxury I couldn't afford. Let me show you where it all began, so you'll understand why the day they abandoned me was the day I truly learned what kind of man I was meant to become. When I look back now, I often wonder if Leeds shaped me just as much as the people who walked in and out of my life. The city had its own rhythm, its own way of teaching you what survival meant. Leeds in the late 1940s and 1950s was not the bustling, modern city people see today. No, back then it was a place of smoke and soot, of factories that coughed out black clouds, and of narrow streets where children played with bare feet and scraped knees, pretending the world outside didn't exist. I grew up in a small terraced house, the kind you could find by the hundreds lined up like bricks in a wall. The houses were close, one after the other, and yet loneliness still managed to find its way inside. The walls were thin, so you could hear neighbors arguing, babies crying, and the whistle of the factory sirens that dictated when men would rise for work and when women would prepare supper. We didn't have much, but back then, not many people did. Poverty wasn't just my family's burden, it was the city's shared cloak. The streets smelled of coal and dampness. Rain was frequent, and when it came, it turned the narrow cobblestone alleys into slippery rivers. I remember the sound of horses' hooves clattering against the stones, though by then, cars had begun to take over. Still, many of us lived as though time hadn't fully moved on. There were no luxuries. Heating the house meant lighting the fireplace with scraps of coal. And if coal was short, which it often was, we huddled together in our coats and blankets, praying the night wouldn't be too cruel. The markets were where you saw the best and the worst of life. Kirkgate Market. I'll never forget it. The smell of fish mixed with the sweetness of fruit. The loud voices of vendors calling out their prices. The clatter of coins. The shuffle of desperate hands searching for a bargain. For some families, shopping there was routine. For mine, it was survival. My mother would clutch a few coins in her palm, carefully calculating how much bread she could afford, whether we could stretch to a bit of meat, or if porridge would have to do again. School was another reminder of our place in the world. The building was old, with wooden desks carved with initials of boys long gone, and chalk dust floating in the air. I wasn't the brightest student, not because I couldn't learn, but because my mind was often elsewhere. Hunger does that to a child, makes lessons blur, makes words on a page dance in front of your eyes. While other boys dreamed of becoming footballers or policemen, I dreamed of food on the table, of warmth in the winter, of shoes without holes. But Leeds wasn't all misery. There were pockets of beauty, moments that made even a boy like me believe in something brighter. Hyde Park, for instance, with its wide stretches of green. On rare afternoons when the sun decided to bless us, children would run and laugh there, their voices filling the air with music. I can still picture the daffodils blooming in spring, their yellow heads swaying gently in the breeze, almost mocking the gray of the city that surrounded them. Sundays were different too. The church bells would ring, echoing through the streets, and for a while, everything seemed calmer. We'd put on our best clothes, though my best was still patched and worn, and walk to the small church at the corner. I didn't understand much of the sermons back then, but I understood the look in people's eyes. For many, faith was the only thing keeping them upright, the only promise that life could mean more than endless struggle. Leeds was a city of contrasts. There were those who lived in larger houses, who never seemed to worry about coal or bread. I'd see them sometimes, their polished shoes clicking on the pavement, their children with clean faces and laughter that didn't sound strained. To a boy like me, they were like creatures from another world. I didn't envy them, not exactly. I just couldn't understand how two lives could exist side by side, one filled with comfort, the other with constant want, and yet there was community. Neighbors knew each other, for better or worse. If someone fell ill, you could count on a knock at the door with a bowl of soup or a loaf of bread. If a man lost his job, word spread quickly, and people would chip in, however little they had. In that sense, the city carried you, even when life tried to break you. Still, for a boy growing up in those streets, time felt heavy. Every year that passed was another year of responsibility pressing down. Childhood was fleeting, almost stolen, because survival didn't wait. I remember evenings when I'd walk by the River Ira, watching the water move steadily, carrying away dirt, leaves, and scraps of paper. I envied that river. No matter how polluted or blocked, it kept flowing, always forward. I told myself I had to be like that to keep moving, even when everything around me tried to hold me still. The 1950s were a time of change for England. People spoke of recovery after the war, of hope for a brighter future. Factories buzzed with life, new buildings rose, and the city tried to rebuild itself. But not everyone shared in that hope equally. For families like mine, the war's shadow lingered long after the bombs stopped falling. Food shortages, job scarcity, and broken households left marks that couldn't be erased by optimism alone. I was too young to understand the politics of it all, but I felt the weight. You didn't need a newspaper to tell you life was hard. You could see it in the weary faces of men leaving the mills at dusk, in the hollow eyes of mothers counting pennies, in the way children clung to scraps of joy as though they were treasures. And yet, even in that place, even in that time, there were sparks, tiny lights that kept me from giving up. A smile from a stranger at the market, the sound of music spilling from a pub on a Friday night, the rare warmth of the sun on my skin as I walked home from school. Little things, yes, but they were proof that life, even in the grimmest of places, could still offer beauty. Leeds was my beginning, for better or worse. It was the soil in which my roots were forced to grow, thin and fragile though they were. It was where I learned that nothing in life comes without a fight, that survival itself can be a full-time job, and that even a boy who feels invisible can carry within him a fire strong enough to one day light the darkness. If you truly want to understand my story, why that day of abandonment cut me so deeply, you have to picture Leeds as it was then. A city wrapped in smoke, struggling between the past and the future. A city where children learned early that life wasn't fair, but also that resilience could be forged in the most unlikely places. That was my Leeds. That was my time. And it was in those streets, under those gray skies, that my story began to unfold. If childhood is meant to be a season of laughter, discovery, and carefree play, then mine must have belonged to another world. I can hardly recall a time when I felt like a child in the way people describe it. For me, boyhood was less about toys and games, and more about burdens that arrived too soon, weights that bent my back before it was fully grown. I was the second of 4 children. My older brother Thomas was always the one expected to lead, but he had a temper and a rebellious streak. My younger sisters, Mary and Ruth, were delicate, often sickly, and my mother clung to them as though they were porcelain dolls. That left me, the quiet one, the dependable one. I was the pair of extra hands when the coal needed hauling, when errands had to be run, or when meals had to be stretched so thin that it was a wonder we survived on them at all. Food, the lack of it, was the constant shadow of my childhood. I remember mornings when the smell of porridge filled the kitchen, thin and watered down, barely more than gruel. We ate it with gratitude because it meant at least something was in our stomachs. On rare occasions, when my father managed steady work at the mill, a piece of bacon or dripping on bread might appear at the table. Those mornings felt like holidays, but far more often, hunger was the uninvited guest that never left. School didn't ease that hunger. In fact, it sharpened it. I can still hear the laughter of boys who had lunches wrapped neatly in wax paper sandwiches with ham, a bit of fruit, maybe even a biscuit. My lunch, when I had one, was usually a slice of bread rubbed with lard. Sometimes I hid it, ashamed. Other times, I ate it slowly, stretching each bite as though that might fool my body into thinking it was enough. But hunger was only part of it. There was also the constant sense of being less important, less cared for, less loved. My father was a man of few words, and most of them were sharp. He believed a boy should be tough, should learn early what the world was like. He had little patience for weakness, and in his eyes, I was never quite strong enough. If the coal bucket wasn't filled quickly, if I stumbled while carrying wood, if my handwriting was crooked on the page, I'd feel his disappointment like a weight pressing on my chest. My mother was gentler, but she was worn thin by life. Her face always seemed tired, her hands always busy. She loved us in her way, but her love was more about survival than affection. A clean shirt, a quick hand on my shoulder as she passed, a whispered prayer before bed. That was her version of care. I don't blame her now. She had too much to carry herself. But as a boy, I often longed for arms around me, for words that told me I was enough. Despite it all, there were moments of light. I remember playing in the alley with a ragged football, its stitching loose, the leather scuffed. We played until our legs ached, until the street lamps flickered on, until the air grew so damp we could see our breath. Those games were my escape, the one place where hunger and duty didn't matter. For those short hours, I could be just another boy, running, shouting, forgetting. And there were friends, though. Friendship in those days was less about loyalty and more about survival. Peter was one of them, a wiry boy with sharp eyes and quicker hands. He could steal an apple from the market without blinking, and more than once, he shared the spoils with me. We laughed about it, pretending it was adventure, but deep down, we both knew it was desperation. Then there was Samuel, whose father drank too much. Samuel's house smelled of beer and sorrow, but he had a warmth about him, a kindness I clung to. We didn't talk much, we didn't need to. Sitting side by side, kicking our legs against the curb, was enough. Of course, childhood also brought its first true pains, the kind that leave marks, invisible to the eye, but heavy on the heart. I'll never forget the day my brother Thomas ran away. He was 14, I was barely 12. He left a note scrawled on a scrap of paper. "I'm not staying here to rot." That was all. I remember my mother crying silently into her apron, my father storming about the house, cursing him as though anger could erase the hole he left behind. For me, it was betrayal and loss rolled into one. I loved Thomas, even with his temper. He was the one who sometimes shielded me from father's wrath, the one who dared to dream aloud of leaving Leeds, of finding something better. When he left, I felt more alone than ever. Not long after that, I had to take on more responsibilities. Chopping wood, running errands, even finding odd jobs after school. I polished shoes for pennies, carried coal sacks, and once even cleaned out the ash bins for a neighbor who gave me a half loaf of bread in return. It wasn't just about helping my family, it was about survival. I knew by then that if I didn't pull my weight, the fragile balance of our household would crumble. Those years carved into me a deep understanding. Nothing was guaranteed. Love could vanish. Food could disappear. Even people you trusted could walk away. And yet, somehow, I also learned to endure. I learned to take the sharpness of my father's words and turn them into fuel. I learned to find joy in scraps, in a shared laugh, in a stolen moment of freedom, in the rare times when my stomach was full. There's one memory that lingers above all others, one that I think captures my childhood better than any words. It was a cold December evening, frost on the windows, our fire barely burning because coal was short. My sisters were asleep, huddled together for warmth, my mother sewing by the dim light of a lamp. I sat by the window, watching the street. Snow began to fall, soft at first, then heavier, blanketing the cobblestones. For a moment, the whole world looked clean, pure, untouched by hardship. I pressed my hand to the glass and whispered to myself, "One day, I'll be free of this." That promise, made by a hungry, shivering boy, stayed with me my whole life. It became the thread I clung to through every trial, every abandonment, every heartbreak. Childhood marked me, yes, but it also gave me a kind of strength I never would have found otherwise. Looking back now, I don't pity that boy. I ache for him, yes, but I also admire him. He learned to survive before he even knew what life was supposed to be. He endured loneliness, hunger, and loss, and still managed to keep a spark alive inside. That spark carried me through more than I can ever fully explain. And so, when people ask why abandonment cut me so deeply later in life, I tell them this: it wasn't just the act itself. It was the echo of every moment in my childhood when I already felt left behind. It was the reopening of wounds that had never truly healed. To understand the man I became, you must first understand the boy who sat by a frosted window in Leeds, watching snow fall and promising himself that one day life would be different. When I tell you that I was abandoned on the worst day of my life, I don't say it lightly. I don't mean the kind of abandonment where someone forgets to pick you up from school or doesn't come to your birthday party. No, I mean the kind of abandonment that cuts through the soul and leaves scars so deep they shape every choice, every fear, and every ounce of strength you carry from then on. It was a cold November day in Leeds. I was just 13, still caught somewhere between boyhood and manhood. The air was sharp, the kind of chill that stings your skin and makes you draw your coat tighter around your shoulders. I remember the sky being gray, as though even it was morning. By then, my family had been falling apart for months. My father's work at the mill had grown inconsistent, and when he wasn't working, he was drinking. The mill owned him, body and soul, and when it didn't need him, he drowned himself in cheap ale at the pub. My mother, already frail, seemed to shrink into herself more each day. Her once busy hands slowed, her eyes grew distant. My sisters clung to her skirts, sensing something was terribly wrong, even if they couldn't name it. I knew something was coming, but I didn't know what. That morning, I woke to silence. No clatter of pots, no cough from my father, no soft humming from my mother. Just silence. I padded into the kitchen to find a note on the table, scrawled in my father's heavy, uneven hand. It said only this: "We can't do this anymore. You'll manage somehow. I didn't understand at first. I thought maybe he had gone to work early. Maybe my mother had taken my sisters to visit someone. But as the hours passed, the truth settled like ice in my chest. They were gone. Both of them. They had left Meal, effed all of us. Though in that moment it felt as though they had left me most of all. I searched the house from top to bottom. My sister's small shoes were missing. My mother's sewing kit was gone. My father's coat no longer hung by the door. It was as if they had erased themselves overnight, leaving me in the shell of a house that already felt too empty. I can't describe the feeling properly. It was part rage, part grief, part disbelief. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I wanted to cry, but the tears felt stuck. I remember sitting on the floor, the note clutched in my hand, my breath coming in sharp gasps, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on me. How could they? How could the people who brought me into this world decide I wasn't worth staying for? For days, I refused to believe it. I told myself they'd come back, that maybe this was a cruel mistake. I sat by the window every evening, watching the street, waiting for their faces to appear, but they never did. The days stretched into weeks, and each morning I woke to the same crushing truth. I had been left behind. The neighbors noticed. Of course, in those tight-knit streets, nothing stayed secret for long. Mrs. Evans, from next door, brought me bread one morning, her eyes soft with pity. She told me she'd seen my parents leaving with their bags before dawn, heading toward the train station. That confirmation shattered what little hope I had left. They hadn't been taken from me. They hadn't died in some accident. They had chosen to leave, chosen to abandon me. That was the day I grew old, though my body was still young. Childhood ended in that silence, in that empty house. From then on, I wasn't just a boy, was an orphan in all but name, a survivor with no one left to lean on. I tried to hold myself together. I went to school, though I could barely focus. Teachers looked at me with a mix of concern and helplessness. Some sent me home with scraps of food. Others pretended not to notice my clothes growing more ragged by the week. At night, I returned to that empty house, lit only by the faint glow of the street lamps outside. The loneliness was unbearable. The silence screamed at me, louder than any argument my parents had ever had. Hunger became my closest companion. With no money, I scavenged what I could. I polished shoes, carried coal, begged at the market. Sometimes, I went without. I lost weight quickly, my bones jutting out under my thin skin. I hated myself for feeling so weak, but what choice did I have? And then came the shame, the whispers. Children at school called me the boy nobody wanted. They said my father was a drunk, my mother a coward. They laughed at my torn clothes, at the hollow look in my eyes. I wanted to fight them, to shout that they didn't understand, but the truth was, they were right. Nobody wanted me. That truth gnawed at me, far worse than hunger ever did. Still, I endured. I don't know how, but I did. There were nights when I thought of ending it all, when the loneliness pressed so heavy I could hardly breathe. But something inside me refused. Maybe it was the promise I'd made to myself, that snowy night, one day, I'll be free of this. Maybe it was stubbornness, or faith, or sheer survival instinct. Whatever it was, it kept me moving forward, one painful step at a time. The abandonment never left me. Even now, decades later, the wound is raw. Birthdays remind me of it. Holidays, the smell of porridge in the morning. Every little detail drags me back to that November day when I realized I was utterly alone. But I'll tell you this, being abandoned didn't break me. It scarred me. Yes, it hardened me. It made me question everything: love, trust, family. Yet it also taught me the most important lesson of my life, that if I was ever going to survive, I could never again rely on anyone else to carry me. From that day on, I carried myself. Of course, I wasn't completely without help. Strangers, neighbors, even classmates showed small kindnesses that stitched me together, piece by fragile piece. But the deep truth remained: I was alone, and I had to build a life from nothing. That was the great loss of my life. The day everything changed. My parents' footsteps faded, but their absence echoed forever. And though I survived it, though I grew stronger because of it, I never stopped feeling that hollow space inside the part of me that still wonders what I did wrong, why I wasn't enough for them to stay. If you truly want to understand the man I became, you have to start here, in this wound, because everything that came after the struggles, the humiliations, the victories, they were all born from this single truth. I was abandoned, and I would never forget it. Survival is a word people throw around lightly. They say things like, I barely survived that meeting, or I can't survive without my morning tea. But true survival, raw, desperate, aching survival is something altogether different. It isn't glamorous, and it certainly isn't a choice. It's waking up each morning with hunger clawing at your belly and loneliness whispering in your ear, and still forcing yourself to put one foot in front of the other. After my parents left, survival became my only task. I was 13, too young to be a man and too old to be a child. The neighbors helped when they could, but nobody had much to give. Leeds was full of families, barely managing themselves. No one could carry an extra mouth indefinitely. And so, I learned quickly that if I wanted food, if I wanted even the smallest scrap of dignity, I had to earn it. The first job I took was shining shoes on Briggate, one of the main streets in Leeds. I borrowed an old box from Mr. Evans' next door, filled it with brushes and tins of polish he no longer used, and set myself up near the shops. The work was humiliating at first. I remember crouching at the feet of well-dressed men, their polished leather shoes gleaming while mine had holes in the soles. Some looked down at me with pity, others with disdain, as though my very existence offended them. A few refused to pay, muttering that boys like me should be grateful for the practice. Still, I endured. Each coin dropped into my palm was another night I wouldn't go to bed hungry. But shoe shining alone wasn't enough. Soon, I began carrying coal sacks for delivery men. The sacks were nearly as big as I was, heavy enough to bruise my shoulders and scrape my arms raw. I'd stagger under the weight, sometimes falling, sometimes choking on the black dust that filled the air. The men laughed at my scrawny frame but paid me a few pennies for my effort. At the end of the day, my body ached so badly I could hardly move, but the small pile of coins in my pocket was proof I was still standing. There were days when no work came. On those days, I turned to the market. I learned quickly which vendors were kind and which were cruel. Some gave me bruised fruit or stale bread out of pity. Others chased me away with curses, waving their fists, as if I were a stray dog. Hunger made me bold. More than once, I swiped an apple or a crust of bread when no one was looking. The guilt burned in me, but the hunger was worse. Nights were the hardest. The house was too big for one boy, its silence pressing in on me like a weight. Sometimes I lit a candle just to keep the darkness at bay, even though candles were precious. The shadows seemed to whisper, reminding me of the emptiness, of the footsteps that would never return. I wrapped myself in whatever rags I could find, praying the cold wouldn't seep too deep into my bones. There were humiliations, too. Once, a group of boys from school cornered me in the alley. They mocked me for being the abandoned rat, grabbed the bread I'd managed to buy, and threw it into the mud. I fought them, God knows. I tried, but there were too many. They left me bruised and empty-handed, the precious bread ruined at my feet. I remember sinking to the ground, fists clenched, tears stinging my eyes. I swore that day that I'd never let anyone see me cry again. But for every cruelty, there were moments of unexpected kindness. Mrs. Evans, the neighbor who had first brought me bread, continued to check on me. She'd slip a bit of stew into a bowl, pretending it was extra so I wouldn't feel like charity. A teacher at school, Mr. Whitaker, quietly gave me books to take home. He told me that no matter how poor I was, knowledge could never be stolen from me. Those small gestures kept me from collapsing completely. As the months turned into years, I grew harder. My hands became calloused, my back stronger, my will sharper. Survival had stripped away any illusions of childhood. I worked wherever I could, cleaning out chimneys, sweeping floors in shops, even scrubbing the steps of strangers' houses for pennies. Each job was a battle, each coin a victory. Still, the hunger never fully left. There were stretches when I went to bed with nothing but water in my stomach. I learned tricks to dull the ache, chewing on scraps of paper, drinking tea made from boiled weeds, even tying a belt tighter around my waist to trick my body into thinking it was full. My face grew gaunt, my clothes hung loose, and more than once I caught my reflection in a shop window and hardly recognized the boy staring back. Loneliness was another enemy, just as fierce as hunger. I watched other families gather for supper, heard laughter spill from their windows, saw fathers lift their children onto their shoulders. It was a life I no longer believed belonged to me. I became invisible, a shadow passing through the streets, unnoticed except when someone needed cheap labor. And yet, despite everything, I refused to give up. Something inside me kept burning, a stubborn spark that wouldn't die. Maybe it was anger at my parents for leaving me. Maybe it was the promise I'd made to myself long ago, staring at falling snow. Or maybe it was simple survival instinct, the same force that drives even the smallest creature to keep fighting. Whatever it was, it kept me alive. The years of struggle shaped me into something I hadn't expected, resilient. I learned to read people's faces, to know when to beg and when to fight, when to speak and when to stay silent. I learned that pride had no place in an empty stomach, but dignity could still be found in perseverance. By the time I was 16, I was no longer the fragile boy left behind. I had become someone different, harder, tougher, but still carrying the wounds of abandonment. I had survived hunger, cold, ridicule, and despair. And though I had nothing to show for it but calloused hands and weary eyes, I knew deep down that I had achieved something monumental. I was still standing. That is the truth about survival. It doesn't make you whole. It doesn't heal the wounds or erase the loneliness. But it keeps you breathing long enough to discover what comes next. And for me, though I didn't know it yet, something was about to change. The struggle for survival was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of a turning point I could never have imagined. Sometimes life bends in ways you don't see coming. You spend years walking through shadows, convinced the road will never change, and then, suddenly, out of nowhere, there's a glimmer of light. That was what happened to me. After years of scraping by, barely keeping my head above water, I stumbled into a moment that altered the course of everything. I was 17 then, hardened by hunger and loneliness, but still too young to realize how much of my life stretched before me. By that time, I had left school entirely. Education was a luxury I couldn't afford. Survival took precedence. My days were spent working odd jobs, loading coal, scrubbing factory floors, sweeping the steps of rich families' houses. My hands were raw, my body often exhausted, but I had learned not to complain. Complaints didn't fill bellies. One evening, I was walking back from a long day at the mill. My boots caked with soot, and my clothes clinging to me with the smell of smoke. The streets of Leeds were quiet, the fog rolling in, thick and heavy, curling between the lamps like ghosts. That was when I heard each voice, faint at first, then clearer as I drew closer. It was music, a piano, soft and steady, spilling from the open doors of a small church I'd passed countless times before. I don't know why I stopped. Perhaps it was the loneliness pressing too heavy on my chest, or perhaps it was something deeper, something guiding me. I stepped inside. The church was nearly empty. A few candles flickered at the altar, casting long shadows across the stone walls. At the piano sat an older man, his hair silver, his fingers moving gently over the keys. He looked up when he saw me, but didn't stop playing. His eyes were kind, steady, the kind of eyes that don't startle easily. I stood there awkwardly, unsure whether to leave or sit. He nodded toward the pews, and I slipped into one, my body tense, ready to bolt at any moment. For the first time in months, maybe years, I let myself sit in silence, listening. The music washed over me, softening the edges of my exhaustion, loosening the knot in my chest. When the last note faded, the man turned to me. "You look hungry," he said simply. I bristled. Hunger was my shame, the thing I never wanted to admit. But something about his tone, gentle, not pitying, made me nod. He disappeared for a moment, then returned with a piece of bread and a small bowl of stew. I devoured it quickly, embarrassed by my own desperation. He didn't comment, just sat beside me, waiting until I finished. That was the beginning of my turning point. His name was Reverend Carter, though he insisted I call him Samuel. He was, unlike any man I had ever met, firm but kind, disciplined but patient. He asked nothing of me at first, only that I stop by whenever I needed a meal or a place to rest. Slowly, cautiously, I did. In those visits, he began to teach me things no one else ever had. He spoke of resilience, not as mere survival, but as the ability to find purpose. He taught me to read scripture, yes, but also to read myself, to see worth where I believed there was none. More than once, I asked him why he bothered with a boy like me, abandoned, ragged, invisible. His answer never changed, because you are not invisible to God, nor to those who choose to see. Those words stayed with me. Samuel wasn't my savior, not in the way fairy tales speak of rescue. He didn't erase my hunger overnight, didn't solve all my struggles, but he gave me something I hadn't had since childhood: belief. Belief that I mattered, that even in my brokenness, I still had value. It wasn't only Samuel who became part of this turning point. The church itself became a place of unexpected refuge. There were others, they're ordinary people, scarred by life just as I was, who welcomed me with warmth. Mrs. Collins, who always brought extra bread for me, pretending it was too much for her family. James, a young man, only a few years older than me, who invited me to kick a football with him and treated me not as a charity case, but as a friend. Through them, I began to see glimpses of a different kind of life, not one defined by abandonment, but by connection. It was terrifying at first. Trust had been ripped from me the day my parents left, and letting anyone close felt like inviting another wound. But slowly, carefully, I allowed myself to believe that not everyone would leave. There was one moment in particular that cemented the change. One Sunday evening, after service, Samuel handed me a small book. Its cover was worn, its pages yellowed with age. It was a collection of poems. "I think you'll find yourself in these words," he told me. At first, I laughed. What use did I have for poetry when I was still struggling to eat? But that night, by the dim light of a candle, I opened the book. The words leaped off the page, speaking of loss, resilience, hope, and the stubborn will of the human heart. For the first time, I saw my own story reflected back at me, not just pain, but survival. That was when something inside me shifted. I realized that while I couldn't change the fact that I had been abandoned, I could choose what came next. I didn't have to be only the boy left behind. I could be the young man who rose from it. Opportunities followed, small at first. Samuel arranged for me to help with repairs around the church, painting walls, fixing benches, tending the small garden. He insisted on paying me a few shillings, though I would have done it for free. With that money, I bought my first proper pair of boots, sturdy and whole. Walking down the street in them, I felt taller, stronger, more like someone who belonged in the world. The real turning point, though, came the day Samuel pulled me aside and said, "Elaine, you've spent enough years surviving. It's time you start living." Those words terrified me. Living meant risk. Living meant hope. And hope, I had learned, could hurt worse than hunger. But Samuel was right. I couldn't let my parents' abandonment define me forever. If I wanted a future, I had to build it myself. And so, with trembling steps, I began to dream again. Small dreams at first, steady work, a roof that felt like home, a life not built on scraps. But even those small dreams were enough to push me forward. Looking back, that chapter of my life was the beginning of everything. Without Samuel, without that piano on that foggy night, I might have remained a shadow, scraping by until the world swallowed me whole. Instead, I found a spark, not salvation in an instant, but a slow, steady flame that grew brighter each day. That is the truth of turning points. They rarely come as miracles. They come as whispers, as bread shared by a stranger, as music drifting from an open door. They come quietly, asking only that you take one step forward, then another. And if you do, you find yourself walking into a life you never believed you could have. Victory does not always come with cheers, banners, or trumpets. Sometimes it comes in the quiet hours of dawn, when no one is watching. Sometimes it is measured not in wealth or applause, but in the dignity of a man who has learned to stand upright, who no longer feels the weight of shame pressing on his shoulders. For me, victory was not sudden. It was gradual, slow, and often invisible to the world around me. But to my own heart, it was monumental. After Reverend Samuel became a steady figure in my life, I found direction. He encouraged me to believe that I was capable of more than just scraping by, and his church became my foundation. The little jobs I did there, fixing a leaky roof, mending broken furniture, tending the small garden, gave me both purpose and income. But more than that, they gave me discipline, the rhythm of responsibility. By the time I turned 18, I had secured steady work at the textile mill on the outskirts of Leeds. The factory was brutal. The machines thundered like beasts, the air thick with dust, and every shift left my body aching. But unlike before, I did not feel like a ghost drifting through life. I had boots on my feet, wages in my pocket, and, more importantly, the sense that I was building something beyond survival. Each week, when I collected my pay, I divided it carefully. A portion went to food, another to savings, though small, and some to the church. For I could never forget how Samuel's kindness had lifted me from the edge. That discipline, learned in scarcity, became the backbone of my future. My true silent victories, however, came not in the mill, but in the choices I made outside of it. I chose to study at night, under candlelight, with the worn poetry book Samuel had given me, and whatever other scraps of literature I could find. My reading improved, my mind sharpened. Slowly, I began to understand that knowledge was a kind of wealth no one could take from me. I remember one evening, sitting at the mill's breakroom table, a coworker sliding a newspaper across to me with a smirk. "Here, Elaine. See if you can make sense of this." I had been the butt of such jokes before. In the past, I would have lowered my eyes, ashamed of my illiteracy. But this time, I picked up the paper and read the headline aloud, steady and clear. Their surprise was a quiet triumph for me. No applause, no praise, but in that moment, I knew I had claimed a piece of dignity that no ridicule could erase. As the years passed, I saved enough to rent a small room of my own. It was nothing more than a single bed, a wooden chair, and a window that looked out over the soot-stained rooftops of Leeds. But it was mine. For a boy who had once slept under bridges, that room was a palace. Each night, as I lay down on my thin mattress, I reminded myself, this is my silent victory. I am no longer at the mercy of the streets. Of course, life was not without its challenges. There were weeks when work slowed, when wages barely stretched to cover food. There were nights when loneliness crept back in, whispering that I was still abandoned, still unworthy. But by then, I had built a fortress of resilience. Samuel's words echoed in my mind. "You are not invisible." And I refused to disappear. Another victory came when I was promoted at the mill. I had shown myself to be reliable, diligent, never late, never careless. The overseer called me into his office one afternoon and offered me the position of supervisor over a small team. It was not wealth, but it was recognition, a statement that I was more than just another cog in the machine. With that promotion, my wages increased slightly. I sent a portion to an orphanage nearby, run by nuns who cared for children much like the boy I once was. I never signed my name to the donations. I did not need credit, but knowing that another hungry child might eat because of my contribution, that was victory enough. It was around that time that I met Margaret. She was not extraordinary in the way stories often describe. She was not wealthy, nor glamorous, but to me, she was remarkable. She worked at the bakery near the mill, her hands always dusted with flour, her smile soft yet unwavering. We spoke first over a loaf of bread, her asking if I wanted it sliced, me too nervous to reply properly. But gradually, conversation grew into companionship, companionship into affection. Loving Margaret was another silent victory. She saw me not as the abandoned boy, not as the factory worker covered in soot, but as a man with worth. With her, I laughed more than I ever thought possible. With her, I learned that tenderness could heal wounds deeper than hunger or cold. When we married, it was a modest affair in the same church where Samuel had first fed me. He stood by my side, his eyes gleaming with quiet pride. There were no grand feasts, no carriages, no lavish celebrations, but there was love, community, and the unshakable knowledge that I was no longer walking alone. Margaret and I built a humble life together. We rented a small terraced house, its walls thin but warm with laughter. She baked bread while I worked, long shifts, and in the evenings, we shared meals at a wooden table that seemed to grow sturdier with every passing year. When our children came, first a daughter, then a son, I felt a victory beyond words. I had feared that the cycle of abandonment would follow me, but holding those little ones in my arms, I swore they would never know the loneliness I had endured. And I kept that promise. My victories remained quiet, but each one stacked upon the other. The first time I could afford a new coat instead of a patched one. The first holiday I gave my children gifts bought with my own wages. The first time neighbors came to me for advice rather than pity. I became, slowly and silently, a man of dignity. Not because I was rich, not because the world applauded me, but because I had reclaimed my self-worth, because I had turned abandonment into resilience, poverty into perseverance, and loneliness into love. When I look back now, I do not see the roar of triumphs or the blaze of glory. I see the steady flame of endurance, the kind that does not flicker even when the winds howl. That, to me, is the truest kind of victory. The world may not have noticed. Newspapers never printed my name. Crowds never cheered my achievements. But my family knew. My community knew. And deep within my own heart, I knew. That is enough. That is victory. If you have followed my story this far, you might expect me to end with something dramatic. Perhaps a grand revelation or a triumphant parade. But my life has taught me that the most powerful lessons are not shouted. They are spoken softly, almost in a whisper, like the steady ticking of a clock, reminding you that time, though relentless, also brings healing. Now, as an old man, with hair white as the Yorkshire snow and hands weathered by decades of labor, I have something precious to offer you. Not wealth, not fame, but perspective. The kind of wisdom that only comes from stumbling through darkness and learning, over many years, where to find the light. I was abandoned on a day no child should ever be left alone. I carried that wound like a stone in my chest for much of my life. But what I want you to remember is this. Being abandoned is not the same as being defeated. Those who leave you behind may think they've written your ending, but only you hold the pen that decides the rest of your story. When I was a boy sleeping under bridges in Leeds, I believed I was invisible. I thought no one would ever see me. But Reverend Samuel saw me. His loaf of bread and cup of tea seemed small, yet to me they were proof that kindness exists even when the world feels cold. That is the first lesson I offer you. Never underestimate the power of a small act of kindness. You may think it insignificant, but to someone drowning in despair, it can feel like a lifeline. As I grew older, I realized that survival is not just about food or shelter. Survival is also about holding on to your dignity when everything tries to strip it from you. In the mill, surrounded by roaring machines and the grit of endless work, I learned to stand tall even when my pockets were nearly empty. I discovered that real strength is quiet. It does not boast. It does not demand recognition. It simply endures. That is my second lesson. True victory is not always loud. It is often silent, steady, and deeply personal. I want you to know something else. Pain does not vanish when you ignore it. For years, I buried my loneliness, thinking that if I worked hard enough, if I kept busy enough, I could silence it. But pain has a way of finding cracks in your armor. It seeps through when you least expect it. What saved me was not pretending I was unhurted. was allowing love to touch the places I thought were beyond repair. Margaret's love, my children's laughter, even the respect of my neighbors, they were the balm that softened old scars. Lesson 3. Let yourself be loved. Do not push away the very thing that might heal you. Looking back, I realized that I measured wealth differently than most men. I never owned great lands or filled bank accounts, but I was rich in ways that matter more. In the warmth of family dinners, in the smile of a child wearing a coat I had worked to buy, in the quiet prayers I whispered at night, knowing I had given something to others who were struggling. My life taught me that wealth is not about how much you own, it is about how much love you can give and receive. Let me also speak to the younger ones who think they must prove themselves to the world. With speed, with success, with the appearance of perfection, I am here to tell you that life is not a race. The man who runs too fast often misses the beauty along the road, the trees, the birds, the faces of people who might have become friends. My victories came slowly. They were not handed to me. I had to build them brick by brick, day by day. So here is lesson 5. Be patient with yourself. Greatness is not always quick, and dignity is never rushed. Sometimes I am asked if I ever forgave those who abandoned me. The truth is complicated. Forgiveness is not a simple door you open once and step through forever. For years, I held on to bitterness, believing that anger protected me. But anger is a heavy stone, and when you carry it too long, it bends your back, weakens your spirit. One day, I realized I did not want to be defined by what had been done to me. So I laid the stone down, not because those who left me deserved forgiveness, but because I deserved peace. That is lesson 6. Forgiveness is not about them, it is about freeing yourself. Now, sitting in my old rocking chair by the window, I often watch the world pass by. I see children running to school with backpacks too big for their small shoulders. I see young men rushing to catch trains, their faces tense with worry about the future. And I want to call out to them, to tell them what I know now, that the things they fear, failure, loss, loneliness, are not the end. They are teachers, harsh, yes, but necessary. Every scar I carry is also a story, and every story is a map that led me here. So if you are listening to me now, perhaps younger than I ever was when I began to understand, I give you this final lesson: never waste your suffering. Do not let it be only pain. Shape it into wisdom, compassion, and resilience. Let it be the fire that forges you, not the weight that buries you. There is one phrase I often tell my grandchildren, a sentence that sums up all that I have lived. You cannot choose how the world treats you, but you can choose how you rise from it. That is the legacy I wish to leave behind. Not bitterness, not regret, but the simple truth that dignity is always possible, even for the abandoned, the poor, the forgotten. And if you ever find yourself on the edge of despair, remember my story. Remember that an abandoned boy from Leeds, left with nothing, built a life full of love, respect, and quiet triumphs. If I could do it, so can you. That is my lesson. That is mission.